Thank you, Gordon, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the distinguished public lecture organized by the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS. It's with great pleasure that I introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Dominic Johnson. Professor Johnson is the Alistair Buchan Professor of International Relations and a Fellow of St. Anthony's College at Oxford University. He is visiting Singapore as the RSIS or S. Rajaratnam Professor of Strategic Studies. For your background, the Raja Prof, as we call it within RSIS, is an internationally recognized academic whose research is not just useful for other academics and graduate students of war and strategy, but must also have potential real-world impact as well. So down the years, RSIS has invited many distinguished Raja Profs, such as, for example, Elliot Cohen, John Mearsheimer, Wang Chi-se, Raja Mohan, Richard Bush, and others. They have shared many penetrating and important insights on a range of issues to our audiences down the years. So in this respect, we are very pleased to have Professor Dominic Johnson with us. He is unusually well positioned to share his views on how human nature affects conflict and cooperation in international relations. He possesses 2 PhDs. He received a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford in Evolutionary Biology, as well as a PhD from Geneva University in Political Science. So the possession of expertise in both disciplines grants him a unique research perspective which draws upon a synthesis of history, political science, psychology, and biology. Professor Johnson has also authored 4 books, which were published by the very top university presses such as Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford. He will be sharing, therefore, his very unique insights on how human overconfidence has played out in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Using the war and other historical cases as case studies, he will explain how cognitive biases orient regime decision makers towards fear, overconfidence, and false optimism, which together combine to increase the propensity for interstate conflict. This topic, incidentally, has wider implications. Political and military tensions between the United States and China, as well as heightened enmity between authoritarian and liberal democratic regimes, are all in some way influenced and exacerbated by human elements such as fear, anxiety, and overconfidence within the individual psyches of each regime's leaders. I believe that all of us are in for a truly fascinating lecture and discussion this afternoon. So with that, I'll stop, and may I now invite Professor Dominic Johnson to deliver his address, please.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you to NTU and RSIS for the opportunity to visit as the Rajaratnam Professor of Strategic Studies, honouring Mr. Rajaratnam's services to the Singapore government and nation, but also especially a thank you to Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, to Dean Kumar Ramakrishna, Adrian Tan and Cindy Go, who's made my trip so smooth and enjoyable, and also other colleagues at RSIS, where I've had the opportunity over the last week to participate in a couple of round tables led by Joel Ng, Pascal Venison and Bernard Liu. Thank you so much for hosting those events. And also thank you to the others I've met at RSIS who've been so welcoming and are doing such important work. Here's my title slide. And this is an outline of the talk I'll give today. But let me first just say that my last trip to Singapore was 30 years ago in 1992 as an 18-year-old backpacker. I never thought it would be this long until I came back. But it's wonderful to be back in Singapore. And some 20 years ago, I wrote this book, Overconfidence and War. So if nothing else, this trip to Singapore has helped to make me feel old. First, a disclaimer. I do not profess to be any kind of expert on Russia or Ukraine, but I have an angle on it, as you can guess. I like to think that the book has been quite prescient, And this sabbatical has given me the opportunity for a retrospective on the book after 20 years, not least about how it applies to recent, current, and also future potential conflicts. And I'm going to give a background to the inspiring puzzle which led me into this work, some theory and evidence about overconfidence, and then applying those lessons to help understand a little bit about the Russia-Ukraine war and then also implications more broadly. So, a major paradox in international relations is the widespread fear and anxiety that underlies the concerns for state security in times of peace, but also the prevalence of overconfidence or false optimism on the eve of war. And this phenomenon is no better illustrated than in Russia's concern for its security and its ill-fated invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And while the hugely more powerful Russia, at least initially, and many outside observers expected a quick victory, a year later their early gains have been reversed and they've become bogged down in a long and bloody war against a hardened opponent with strong allies. However, while this is a new war, it is, at least to me, through my eyes, an old story. These are Russian tanks in Bucha, which were met by Ukrainian forces on their way to try and encircle Kiev at the beginning of the war in 2022. Consider, for example, the following, looking back in history. We are confident, our defences are strong, and our weapons efficient. We have one aim and one aim only. It is to defend these shores, to destroy such of our enemies as may set foot on our soil. Now, many of you may recognise those words. They came 2 months before the fall of Singapore, and with the order of the day published in the Malay Tribune in 1941. To me, the fall of Singapore is a very interesting example of overconfidence. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there was a very rapid Japanese advance down through the Malay Peninsula and ultimately into the so-called impregnable fortress of Singapore, which fell at astonishing speed. And you'll have seen this picture before of the British General Percival and his staff carrying the surrender flag to Yamashita at the Ford factory. And the astonishing thing about the fall of Singapore was the fact that the Japanese were outnumbered 2-1. And I would argue there was, among many other factors, a noticeable overconfidence among the Allied forces, that they did not think the Japanese would be able to advance, especially with tanks, through the Malay jungle. They did not expect them to be able to mount night attacks bombing Singapore. They did not expect the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to be sunk by Japanese bombers, even though they had deliberately taken those ships along the coast to try and intercept the Japanese invasion force without air cover. General Archibald Wavell, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Far East, was shocked that so little had been done to prepare defences in Singapore. Overconfidence, to the extent that it contributed, had massive implications for the war effort. Churchill declared it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Not only the loss of Malaya and Singapore, but also 130,000 POWs who were taken out of the war. Now I understand, of course, many of you in the audience will know much more about this case than me, but I thought it would help bring home the topic of today's lecture to you in Singapore. It also brought the topic home to me and my family. My great-uncle Teddy was here at the fall of Singapore. He was a crewman on a merchant navy ship and disappeared at the fall of Singapore. We didn't hear anything from him until after the war, and I only saw this telegram myself a few weeks ago when I was researching this. 22nd of September 1945, after 3.5 years, our family didn't know if he was dead or alive. We received this telegram. Am safe in Australian hands. Hope to be home soon. So that's one example of overconfidence, I would argue. But actually, that is just déjà vu for many others. Ukraine and Singapore are not unique. Russia, for example, also severely underestimated Japan in the 1904-05 Russo-Japanese War, political scientist Richard Ned Lebow wrote that the magnitude of Russia's defeat stood in sharp contrast to her leader's expectation of victory. From the onset of the crisis, the Russians were so certain of their superiority that they were convinced that Japan would not even think of a test of arms at all. And this was even though Japan had a superior navy and an army that outnumbered theirs by 3-1. Russia again severely underestimated Austria and Germany in 1914, and of all the great powers in 1914, given their relatively recent defeat by Japan, perhaps Russia should have had the least illusions of victory. And yet the war minister, General Sukhomlinov, was confident in private as well as in public that victory was possible and could be achieved in a few months, and most of the Russian ministers agreed with him. Their optimism was also evident in the facts of Russian planning as well. Russia settled on an extremely ambitious strategy that would involve a three-pronged attack on Germany and Austria simultaneously. The Second World War shows that Russia was not unique either. One could argue that Stalin seriously underestimated Hitler, but Hitler also underestimated Russia as well as Britain. And it was not only one-sided. Japan also underestimated the United States. And the story goes on because the United States is not immune to this charge either. Arguably, the US has repeatedly overestimated its ability to prevail in war, or at least to control events, and underestimated its opponents. And here, the fall of Saigon marks the final failure of the US effort in Vietnam. It wasn't long until the so-called ghosts of Vietnam were buried in the sands of Arabia during the Persian Gulf War. But then during the 2003 Iraq War, there was arguably significant overconfidence in Rumsfeld's invasion light strategy and the belief that they would be greeted as liberators. The war was far worse, longer and harder than anticipated, and caused years of chaos in the region. And then I don't need to remind you of 2021, where we see an image very reminiscent of the Saigon image of a US helicopter taking people off the US embassy in a very chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. So I would argue that a recurring phenomenon in the history of war is overconfidence. Here is Pericles giving his funerary oration at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, honoring those fallen at the beginning of the war, and yet encouraging more Greeks to go and fight for the glory of Athens in a war that they were sure they would win. But after a very costly quarter-century war, they would ultimately lose to Sparta. It's not just Russia, nor the USA, nor Britain or France. Many other states, whether on the offensive or defensive side, have shown remarkable overconfidence on the eve of war. Overconfidence always seems to be there amidst the many other factors, and they seem to matter to the decisions that leaders make. And it suggests, I think, especially given that we keep seeing this recur across context, that there might be some underlying reason why this should be the case. So, where are we in the talk outline? Here is where I want to talk about the so-called war puzzle. The recurrence of a striking false optimism on the eve of war speaks to a broader debate in the international relations literature on the idea that war itself is a puzzle. So here are spent shells during World War I. And scholars in the field of international relations have often regarded war as a puzzle because if states were rational actors, or at least approximately rational actors, they should be able to avoid the risks of war in a pre-war bargain that reflects their relative power and that avoids the costs of war. Yet wars still occur, even when both sides would have been better off avoiding it, and the risks and costs of war are high, both for winners and losers alike. Now, of course, various explanations have been proposed within the rational actor paradigm, assuming that states are rational, to help explain this. For example, poor information. Perhaps you just have bad information, you make good decisions, but given that the information was poor, the outcome is poor too. But even these explanations leave many outstanding puzzles, like the many examples I gave earlier. So a different approach, which is the one I take, is to suggest that maybe states and their leaders are not entirely rational after all. And that opens up room to consider overconfidence as a cause of war. So revisiting the war puzzle, often states do not make rational assessments of their power or their relative power compared to rivals. And in fact, it seems that on average, they systematically overestimate it. I realize that's a big claim, but this was my general finding from the book. And the other interesting thing is that this matters for any and all wars, because it's a proximate mechanism that makes war appear to be a good solution, to have good odds of success, regardless of whatever is the underlying reason for the war, whether that's based on territorial, geopolitical, political, or other grievances. Overconfidence can be the trigger to decide war is a good idea. Now, historians have noted this. Geoffrey Blainey wrote a book called The Causes of War in 1973. And he wasn't looking for overconfidence, but he found it everywhere. And he wrote that recurring optimism is a vital prelude to war. Anything which increases that optimism is a cause of war, and anything which dampens that optimism is a cause of peace. This is crucial because it shows that it's not always there as a constant. It goes up and down. And when it's high levels, that's when it seems to be associated with conflict. So it's a causal mechanism. 25 years later, the American political scientist Stephen Van Evera wrote a book also called The Causes of War. And again, he wasn't looking for overconfidence. He was a realist. He wanted to understand the role of power in leading to war. But he actually had to dedicate an entire chapter to what he called false optimism, because he found it everywhere. At least false optimism, he wrote, about relative power preceded every major war since 1740, as well as many lesser and ancient wars. So his book was 20 years ago as well now, but others have noticed this problem carrying on. So this is Stephen Walt, another realist in the United States, who in foreign policy criticized the United States for its wishful thinking in general in US foreign policy. And he highlighted a set of specific things that he noticed that the US government tended to do, which demonstrated this constant problem of overconfidence. For example, that China won't act like a great power, that using the big stick will bring big benefits, and that it won't take long to achieve results, and so on. So my argument today really is that we should not be surprised if we see overconfidence in modern conflicts, including that in Russia-Ukraine war today. I would argue that Russia clearly overestimated its capabilities. For example, in its initial plan to reach Kyiv. So these are destroyed tanks in a village close to Kyiv right at the beginning of the war, during their attempt to encircle and take the capital. Russia also, as well as overestimating its own capabilities, seemed to have severely underestimated Ukraine and underestimated the allies that would emerge as a result. I think overconfidence is evident in its plans, its logistics, and its failure to achieve its objectives, and I'll go into a bit more detail on that later. But the point here is that it seems to be in a long line of observing exactly the same problem in the past. So overconfidence is widespread, but why? So here, I want to introduce some reasons to think that we should expect overconfidence. The cognitive revolution in psychology has taken over from behaviorism and psychoanalysis in recent decades and highlights instead the scientific study of cognitive processes, observable behaviors, brain activity, and structure. And through careful scientific work, people like Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work, have identified that all of us as humans have numerous biases in our judgment and decision-making, violating the expectations of rational choice, including things like the anchoring bias, cognitive dissonance, resistance to new ideas, groupthink, tending to think like those around us in a decision-making group, the in-group, out-group bias, the aversion to losses, which is much stronger than the equivalent preference for gains, and including overconfidence, as well as many other biases. And this has really changed our understanding of how it is that people in general, but also political leaders, perceive and make judgments. Now, this has been adopted in the field of international relations, in particular in the work of the late Bob Jervis, who did wonderful work showing that these biases can really matter in political decision making. But he and others have shown, for example, that specific cognitive biases help explain things like the decision to escalate during the Vietnam War. They can help to explain things like the level of hostility during the Cold War. And they can help to explain puzzling decisions like Japan's decision to attack the United States in 1941, which seems to be at least aggravated by the aversion to losses, which is a common bias that we all have, and contributed to the decision that that was the time to fight. Do these biases matter? I would argue absolutely. Power is regarded as crucial in international relations theory and practice. The saying goes that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. But as I like to tell my students, what matters is not power itself, but perceptions of power. Why? Because decision makers act on what they believe, not necessarily what is true. International crises and wars are hugely complex, but biases add a critical layer of insight on top. Now, you won't be surprised perhaps to know that there's been a huge cottage industry develop on documenting all of these biases that we have. And this is one illustration that you can find on the web called the Cognitive Bias Codex. And you can't read them, I know. But each one of those tiny little lines in the circle is a specific cognitive bias that's been identified in laboratory experiments. And this is an effort to kind of categorize them into broad types of things that the human brain is trying to do. It's a laundry list. But there are two crucial things which come out of this. Daniel Kahneman, who I mentioned earlier, the founder of this field and the Nobel laureate in behavioral economics, wrote that the bottom line is that all the biases in judgment that have been identified in the last 15 years tend to bias decision-making towards the hawkish side. I'm not sure that's quite true 100%, but his point is these are a problem. They lead us to make more hostile and conflictual decisions than we should. But he also said, and I thank my colleague Pascal Venison for this, that if he had a magic wand, overconfidence among all of those is the one bias that he would most like to eliminate. It's the one that causes us the real significant problems. But what is overconfidence? Well, it's been studied quite significantly in social psychology, and they tend to call it positive illusions. The key point is that people are more positive than is warranted by the evidence. This is something you can test in the lab or test in the field. It can be tested against a benchmark. For example, they have asked people how they thought they did in exams as they left the exam room, and then they can get a concrete baseline from the actual results. But you can also test it in comparisons with other people. You can also have people's assessments judged by third parties. So there are many ways you can actually measure people's level of overconfidence. And in particular, the social psychologists have identified a tendency to overestimate our abilities, our control over events, and our prospects for the future. And the book on the left is Shelley Taylor, the UCLA psychologist book, Positive Illusions, which came out in 1989 and helped generate this field. The book below is by Tali Sharot, which came out in 2011. And she is a neuroscientist. And what's happened in the time since Shelley Taylor's work is that they've actually been able to document what is going on inside the brain through brain scans and very careful laboratory experiments to demonstrate the evidence for overconfidence actually being formed in the brain as people make their decisions. So there's something real going on here. It's not just a kind of airy-fairy psychological idea. This is the way the brain seems to work. So at this point, I'd just like to point out that obviously this is suggestive in the Russia case. You remember the three things that make up positive illusions. Russia did seem to overestimate its capabilities, its control over events, and to expect favorable outcomes. I also want to emphasize that I'm not targeting any particular individual. Putin is very interesting from this perspective, but it's not just Putin who seems to have exhibited these biases. Other figures in the military, plus also the fact over the last 2 decades, Russia has experienced this military revival and actually become much more proactive in its military engagements. And it has learnt from Crimea and also from Syria that it can achieve success. So I think that exacerbated its expectations of being able to do well. And then more broadly, there's this greater Russian narrative that historically and in terms of identity, Russia sees itself as deserving and able to do more and to have more than it currently does, all of which exacerbate this overconfidence. But before we look in more detail at the Russia-Ukraine case, we need a little bit more evidence. As you've noticed, I've sort of plucked the evidence from the social psychology literature. But how do we know that it applies to war? Do people display the same optimistic biases in political relevant contexts? Maybe these biases don't transfer to the world of international relations and politics. So in some work I've done with colleagues in the US, we tried to test some of these ideas more explicitly. This is Steve Rosen on the left, who actually was a Raja professor, and I think in 2015. Rose McDermott in the middle, and Richard Wrangham, who's an anthropologist, on the right. And we did some experiments with students at Harvard. And you might think they're all very peaceable students working away in the library and wouldn't know anything about conflicts, but these are actually the students who were in our sample at the time of the experiment, who not only protested vociferously against the government and the university, but also occupied Larry Summers' office, who was the president of Harvard at the time. So we thought they were a suitable sample. Very simple experiments, but this was the first time that anyone had tried to take the idea of positive illusions into the laboratory and test it in politically relevant circumstances. So we had a very simple experimental setup where we created a hypothetical conflict over resources. We had 200 subjects paired anonymously and then interacting over computers. And they played in a game, basically a war game. They had to allocate a budget, and over 6 rounds of play, making open-ended decisions, basically decide what to do in order to resolve this contest over contested resources. And then crucially, we had all participants estimate their level of expected success. What did we find? Well, first of all, people were overly confident about their likelihood of success before the game. So you ask them, how well do you think you will do compared to everyone else before they played the game? And you saw dramatic levels of overconfidence. People expected to do much better than was possible. But after they had played the game, but before they knew the results, they had learned during the process that they were overconfident and scaled back how well they thought they had done. But the most important result was they were able to show that their level of overconfidence was related to their level of aggression in the game. So those who were more overconfident were more likely to make unprovoked attacks on their opponents. And these are the data. So on the y-axis, you have their pre-game self-ranking, which is how well do you think you will do? Will you be number 1 out of these 200 people, or number 200 at the bottom, or 100 somewhere in the middle? So you can see in the dark bar, which are the hawks, the people who made unprovoked attacks on their opponent. They didn't have to attack each other. You could negotiate, you could compromise, or you could attack and try and defeat them and take the resource for yourself. The hawks had a much lower pre-game self-ranking. They were the ones who expected to do better at the beginning. So one experiment doesn't change the world, but step by step, we do more experiments and gradually demonstrate that overconfidence is associated in controlled laboratory conditions with the kind of outcomes we're interested in. Now, having published that experiment, people said, well, okay, but do people display similar biases in more realistic scenarios? And perhaps we need to control for political ideology. Maybe people were just trying to win the game, or it was reflecting their underlying political leanings. So we did some more experiments on crisis decision making. Again, we had hypothetical international crisis scenarios, a hostage crisis, a crisis in the Afghanistan campaign that was still going on at the time, and a Latin American coup. And people could choose from 3 possible responses that were written out in narrative form. And basically they could choose to concede. It sounds terrible, but it was worded in such a way that that was potentially a good diplomatic option. Or they could negotiate somewhere in the middle, or they could take the aggressive option and attack the other side. And then again, we measured their confidence in success. How likely do you think it is that your chosen policy, whatever it is, will succeed? And when you put all the data together across the scenarios, and they were randomized, so people were taking different scenarios in different orders, you find a very strong correlation between the level of confidence they expressed in their policy working and the aggression associated with it. So those people who are more confident that their chosen policy would succeed were the more aggressive ones. So again, further evidence that confidence is associated with aggression. We looked at political ideology. So this is a 7-point scale going from very liberal on the left to very conservative on the right. There was a strong statistical relationship here. So the more right-leaning you were, the more likely you were to be aggressive in the game. So that was an important finding as well. But it also meant that we could remove it statistically and test whether confidence was still associated with aggression once you statistically control for people's political leanings. And confidence remains significant. But then we wanted to know, well, does this have anything to do with real-world judgments? So in the same experiment, we also asked these people what their view was of the, at the time, surge in troop numbers being sent to Iraq. So the question was, will the surge improve security in Iraq? And what you found is that those who said yes were significantly more likely to have chosen aggressive strategies in the game. We also asked them about the potential for bombing Iran. Did they have a preference for bombing Iran because of the potential nuclear program in a hypothetical future scenario? And those who were more likely to favor bombing Iran were also those who were more likely to choose the aggressive strategies in the game. So again, just another experiment, and we need more, but empirical evidence demonstrating that confidence is associated with aggression. We're not just plucking this anymore out of the social psychology literature, but we've got our own evidence suggesting that confidence is associated with aggression. Now, I'm sure many of you are much more interested in the real world than in the laboratory. So my other task was to do historical case studies to try and demonstrate whether the kinds of observable implications of positive illusions as defined in the literature play out in the real world of political decision making. And that was the task of this book, Overconfidence and War. So I looked at different case studies and then carefully went through secondary and archival sources to try and identify whether overconfidence was a causal factor leading to the decisions for war. And other people had studied it, but not explicitly with reference to these positive illusions and cognitive biases. So I did that for World War I, Vietnam and Iraq, where positive illusions were very clearly evident. But I also looked at two crises, two situations which could easily have resulted in war. And the prediction might be, well, if positive illusions are so prevalent and so important, why didn't they cause war then? And the idea of those crisis case studies was to show that there are times when positive illusions can be suppressed. There's variation. There are reasons why sometimes they're stronger or weaker. There are decision-making practices which can guard against them. And President Kennedy's ExComm committee, cross-party ExComm committee in the Cuban Missile Crisis seemed to very much help eliminate the worst of those biases and help to identify a way to achieve peace. Similarly, in the Munich crisis, Chamberlain was overconfident, but overconfident about his ability to find peace. There was no very strong overconfidence about their likelihood of winning a war in 1938. So the predictions seem to be borne out that positive illusions cause war, but can be suppressed to avoid it as well. Now, important question at this point is, when are we more or less overconfident? And this becomes important for making predictions about the Russia-Ukraine war and other real-world scenarios. So in other work I've done since the book, I've developed this idea of the Rubicon theory of war. And this is really to highlight the point that overconfidence is prevalent, but it's not a constant. There are actually many sources of variation, and these were identified by the social psychologist. Shelley Taylor argues that positive illusions can be obliterated 100% if you have the right conditions in place. She also mentioned that there's important cultural variation. She wrote that Americans are the most optimistic people on earth. And as you go around to different nations, you actually find that levels of positive illusions, as recorded by psychologists in experiments, actually do vary quite a bit. They seem to be always there, framed in slightly different ways, but there's variation. But a key variable that we found to be very important is the role of mindset. And again, this draws from the psychology literature, which shows that there's a very significant change before and after making a decision. When we're deciding what we want to do, we seem to have a deliberative mindset, and we actually act in a fairly even-handed manner, approximating even rationality. But after having made the decision, you've bought the car that you looked at, and you've driven it home. Now we move into an implemental mindset. After having made the decision, that's when we seem to exhibit much stronger biases. That's when we allow our brains to convince us that we've done the right thing and now we just have to get on and do it. So we did a case study of the First World War, tracing the decision making, and you may know from the First World War literature that there is quite a mix of opinion about the extent to which the European powers really were overconfident about their chances of success, all the cheering and celebrations and rushing off to war. Well, there was actually quite a lot of hesitation too. Moltke, for example, in Germany, believed that it was going to be a painful and bloody war. So there's a mixture of opinion. But what we say in this paper is that actually it depends when you look, because the Rubicon theory predicts that up until the decision, we should expect them to be fairly cautious and fairly rational. And it's after having made the decision for war that these biases, including overconfidence, really kick in. So that's one important source of variation. And we had some interesting evidence that this might be supported from the 91 Gulf War. This is a public opinion poll asking responses to the question, do you think the war between the United States and Iraq would be relatively short, lasting a few weeks? Or do you think such a war would last for a long time, a year or more? And this same question was asked over time from August 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, up until the beginning of the war in February 91. And as you can see, the black dots are those who anticipated a short war. And it hovered around a sort of similar level, almost 50-50 in the December of 1990. But right up before the war, there was suddenly this great increase in the expectation that war would be short. And this is exactly in line with the Rubicon theory of war. Now, another really important source of variation, people always ask me, are there times when people are not overconfident? And in fact, they're biased in the opposite way. Are they ever negatively biased? And there is, in fact, a lot of reasons to believe this is very important. We can also be cautious and fearful. And in the international relations literature, you'll find a great host of writing on exactly this point, that states often seem to exaggerate threats. They seem to be especially sensitive to losses, and they seem to learn more from failure than they do from success. There's also something there where negative events seem to have very powerful effects on our thinking and behavior. And this has been written about in the psychological literature as the negativity bias. The negative events have a very powerful effect on our cognition and motivation and emotion, and our information processing and our decision making. The psychologist Roy Baumeister titled his review of this literature as "Bad is Stronger Than Good." In the international relations literature, Jack Livy and William Thompson, in their book Causes of War, argued that exaggeration of the hostility of the adversary's intentions is a particularly common pattern in the process leading to war. But how do we square that with this? And in another paper I wrote with my longtime colleague, British political scientist Dominic, we have a book called Bad World, the Negativity Bias and International Relations. And what we do is demonstrate that we can reconcile these positive and negative biases, because positive biases tend to center on perceptions of self, We think we are capable, we're in control of events, we expect a good future. And the negative biases center on perceptions of the environment. I'm confident about myself, but I'm concerned and fearful about the environment. There are threats out there, and I'm extremely concerned about those. It actually makes perfect sense. Kumar mentioned that I have a background in evolutionary biology, and in the paper we point out that this is perhaps the right set of biases to have. You want to be cautious and careful and aware of dangers in your environment. But when you meet them and have to deal with them, you also need to be confident in order to deal with them effectively. So we think it's probably adaptive and makes perfect sense. You would have positive perceptions of the self and negative perceptions of the environment. But this is a very important source of variation in biases, which I will show has some important effects, precisely because of their interaction. Exaggerated fears in times of peace, which we see all throughout the world in countries always preparing for the inevitable. Exaggerated fear in times of peace can be accounted for by the negativity bias, in which threats and negative events have a much greater effect on our perceptions than do positive ones. But meanwhile, overconfidence on the eve of war can be accounted for by the Rubicon theory, describing the significant shift in people's susceptibility to cognitive biases after making the decision and then implementing it. And it's the coexistence of these biases which dramatically increases the potential for conflict, because decision makers simultaneously exaggerate the severity of threats they face and, at the same time, exhibit overconfidence about their capacity to deal with them. Now, it may seem theoretical, but there's some really powerful historical examples of exactly this. This map is 1914 Europe. Germany was extremely concerned about encirclement from Russia, France, and Britain in particular. And that fear, arguably, is what drove them to war. They believed that while they were subject to this enormous threat, war would be the solution. You might also think of Vietnam and the US's great concern of the fall of the dominoes. If they let Vietnam fall, then communism would spread throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. And then the other recent example, of course, is Iraq and WMD in 2003. This extraordinarily exaggerated fear that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and the idea that war would solve the problem. So this interaction of the positive and negative biases seems to be a particular recipe for disaster. So now, having talked about the origins of the war puzzle, the idea that overconfidence might be a cause of war, the theory in psychology which suggests we should expect it, and then some evidence demonstrating that this seems to play out in historical cases, we can apply some of these sources of variation to the Russia-Ukraine war. So I want to talk about the implications of overconfidence for the invasion, for the war as it is now, for the Russian leadership, what the interaction between those positive and negative biases mean, also the implications for allies, and then finally for the prospects of peace. And these are all very broad brush predictions coming from this literature. So first of all, the Russian invasion. So many commentators, I'm sure you've read, have already identified Russian overconfidence. But I think the Russian planning and the actions they undertook itself betray it pretty clearly. And I look forward to discussing this with you at the end of the lecture. But they clearly had an expectation of quick victory. Their original plan was to encircle Kyiv. And this picture is the 40-mile-long Russian convoy, which was trying to do exactly that, but got completely bogged down and never made it into Kyiv. They also had a hugely ambitious aim. Right? They weren't just trying to chip off little bits of Ukraine. They were trying to conquer the entire state and capture the capital. And then finally, they only committed limited troops. It was a pretty big force that assembled on the border. But you'll remember that quite soon afterwards, they needed to make wider call-ups to fill up their numbers and to replenish their logistics, which had been seriously depleted. So just observing the facts on the ground, I think, betray quite significant overconfidence in the invasion itself. What about the war now? The maps on the left show the Russian gains in pink. Top left at the time of the invasion, top right, the initial March invasion in the north and the south and in the east. And then the bottom left shows the territory regained by Ukraine since, by November, the end of last year. And then the bottom right is June 2023, where they've been pushed back more or less to the southeast and to the Donbass region. So clearly Russia has scaled back. But I think what's interesting here is that it shows no signs of backing down, despite what it now has, which is a much greater challenge. First of all, because Ukraine is a much hardened foe. It's harder to fight Ukraine now than it was at the beginning of the war. There are also the global sanctions that Russia is having to deal with. There's also the fact that so many allies have come to Ukraine's aid. The huge amounts of arms which are pouring into Ukraine now. And then also the expansion of the NATO alliance itself. Craig Singleton, who's the senior China fellow at the Foundation of Defense for Democracies, wrote, even though more Russian soldiers have perished in Ukraine than during all Russian wars combined since World War II, Putin remains entirely too confident that he can still defeat Ukraine and too stubborn to change course. I would just add that the fact they are continuing in the way they are just seems to demonstrate overconfidence again. It's also interesting to consider leadership. So my argument really is that we all are subject to these biases, the usual cognitive biases that we all have as mentally healthy human beings. But I think it's quite clear that they are exacerbated in this case by the regime type, which allows these biases to be unchallenged. Also by the leadership style of Putin himself, which seems to have its own overconfidence within it. The experience he's had in his political career and his career before that is very much one in which he will achieve what he wants to. And then it's difficult to get into questions of personality, but I think there's clearly variation among individuals in the level of overconfidence and positive illusions that they have. And I would argue that he is quite far on the end of the spectrum. Interestingly as well, overconfidence has arguably threatened his own regime's survival. So it seems to have been particularly disastrous because of its domestic implications as well as its foreign ones. Natalia Antonova wrote in Foreign Policy last July that the truth is Putin is overconfident. He's surrounded himself with yes men, and that's a particular problem when it comes to convincing him the cost for Russia is too high. Think back to the war puzzle. Also, the boss of British GCHQ intelligence, Sir Jeremy Fleming, wrote in The Guardian that he believed that Putin's advisors are afraid to tell him the truth. So even if Putin is not overconfident himself, I think he is, even if he is not, it's quite likely that the leadership structure he has in place is going to generate overconfidence because he might not know the full truth of what people think around him and what the true facts on the ground are. There's also this interesting idea that maybe his close advisors are to blame as well. And you've probably seen lots of pictures similar to this, where he has this very interesting standoff. It used to be partly to do with COVID, but I think it's also part of his style that seems to breed overconfidence and let it be untested by so-called close advisors. Philip Breedlove, who is the former NATO commander, now at the Middle East Institute, argues that Russia was listening to its own propaganda, that Ukraine is not really Ukraine, it's just Russia. And they saw themselves as liberators. Putin clearly seemed to believe something along these lines, and it's just not clear that he's being challenged in those views. And what about the interacting biases that I talked about? The negativity bias, making us exaggerate threats to our security, and the Rubicon effect, suggesting that overconfidence is a causal mechanism in the causes of war. I think there's evidence that overconfidence has been there throughout, but if anything, it's increased at the implemental stage of the war, after having made the decision, precisely because Russia has doubled down against a strengthening opponent. against growing allies and arms, and in the face of sanctions and increasing threats and internal discontent at home. So this toxic combination that I talked about, in which Russia perceived Western threats to its security and at the same time believed it could resolve them through war. But the result is that it actually increased its own insecurity, both foreign and domestic. What about allies? This is a really important dimension of the war. The war will go on as long as Ukraine has significant support from the outside. Here's William Burns, the CIA director, saying himself that Putin seems overconfident that Russia can grind down Ukraine. And in particular, he argues that Putin is underestimating US resolve to carry on supporting Ukraine. It seems that states seem to underestimate alliance partners as well as their foes. And I think it's very clear that Russia severely underestimated the breadth and resolve and speed of the sanctioning states, and also the amount of aid that would come from NATO, and the idea that NATO would expand as well. So as well as overestimating itself, underestimating its enemy, it also seemed to have underestimated alliance partners. And finally, on Russia-Ukraine, what about the prospects of peace? Well, this is a very simple message, but I think it's very powerful and very important. Recall the war puzzle. If one or both sides do not correctly perceive their relative power, they are unlikely to agree on any mutually acceptable solution. Both sides, Russia and Ukraine, seem to believe that they can still win, or at least that they can keep fighting, or get themselves into a position to lose better. This is Putin speaking to Xi at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand in September last year. But whatever else happens through other powers, other mediators, it's this perception of their power and their ability to keep fighting which will prevent, ultimately, any peaceful solution. So I'm coming to the end, and I want to end with some more broad predictions for Europe and Asia. So again, it's very basic predictions coming out of the overconfidence literature. The key point here is that power matters, and relative power perhaps matters more. But what matters most of all is perceptions of relative power, as illustrated in many of the examples we saw before. But it has multiple important effects, not only on over-optimism and war, but also on whether we can effectively deter potential rivals, as well as our overreach in planning for the next war, or our over-optimism on the eve of the next war, or our failure to find negotiated solutions. So what happens if we apply these predictions more generally? So states exhibit two persistent biases: the negativity bias, which exaggerates their fear for their security, overconfidence, and their overestimation of their capabilities, and this toxic mix of fear and overconfidence. What does that mean, for example, for NATO and Russia more broadly? So again, I want to emphasize there are many important factors here, and I'm racing over those just to make points about overconfidence. But over and above those important factors, here are some simple predictions. The negativity bias predicts that Russia will exaggerate the threat from NATO. And many people have argued that that was a cause of the war. That's come to be known as the myth. People in the West don't think that's a valid explanation. But remember the important point here. The threat to Russia doesn't have to be genuine. It doesn't have to be real. It just has to be perceived that way by Russia. Also, NATO underestimates the threat it poses to Russia because it's not factoring in the fact that Russia will exaggerate whatever that threat is. On the overconfidence side, both sides overestimate their relative capabilities and its deterrent. For example, NATO clearly failed to deter Russia in the first place from invading Ukraine. Both also overestimate their control over events and the risks of war and escalation. This is particularly concerning. But the result of all this, I think, is simply that the Ukraine war will be more costly and drag on longer than necessary, precisely because the two sides involved, and to some extent their allies, are not perceiving facts exactly as they are on the ground. But we should not be surprised by that. I also have some observations about Asia and the rivalry between the US and China. Again, simple predictions. We all argue about the status and durability of the US and China's economic and military power. And that's not surprising because it still remains unclear. But again, I emphasize that it does not matter as much as how elite decision makers perceive it. The danger is if they perceive the threat to be greater than it is, if they perceive themselves to be stronger than they are, or if they perceive change to be happening faster than it is. There already are significant and genuine threats and dangers. And the problem is that they are likely to appear even greater than whatever the reality may be. Now, this map is showing the days on station that the new AUKUS nuclear submarines will be able to conduct in different parts of Southeast Asia. And basically the story here is, given they have the new nuclear submarines based in Australia, they'll be able to encircle this whole area for much longer times. They'll be there all the time. And it seems striking to me that this is seen as a defensive move from the West, but could easily be interpreted the other way from China. Over and above many other important factors, the basic predictions are, from the negativity bias, that both exaggerate the threat. I think especially the US will exaggerate the threat because it's the declining power. It is facing the greater danger, the greater threat to its raison d'etre, its hegemony. On the overconfidence side, both overestimate their relative capabilities. And importantly, this is especially given the ambiguity over relative power. Precisely because China is rising and it's hard to predict how fast relative to the US, that makes assessing relative power especially difficult. And when it's difficult, that's when our cognitive biases kick in. Both overestimate the control over events, and there are many flashpoints where control becomes crucial to maintaining peace rather than war. The interaction of these two biases, the exaggerated fear, the exaggerated threat, but then the overestimation of their ability to deal with it, I think is extremely dangerous. And the other point to make is that the alliance system in the region, I think, is something that cannot be assumed. And interestingly enough, it's precisely the confidence and commitment and determination by each side which is likely to attract alliance partners, perhaps more than deter them. So the broad implications here is, unfortunately, that war is more likely than it should be over any given flashpoint, and regardless of the broader causes at issue, because both sides exaggerate the threat from the other, and also their relative power and their ability to deal with it. There is likely to be somewhat more room for negotiated solutions than it seems, because the actual threat and capabilities are lower than they appear. And paradoxically, high levels of confidence, though, are crucial for deterrence. Any sign of doubt undermine credibility. It's crucial for alliances as well. Commitment is crucial to keep allies on side. I'm not sure, for example, the US is doing enough in that respect. And it's important for resolve as well. One has to some extent believe that success is possible. So the broad implications here are that, given what we know from psychology and from the history of past wars and crises, the likelihood is that the US and other nations are overestimating threats from rising power like China, also overestimating their ability to compete or contain it. They should be worried, of course, but the point here is, how worried should they be? History suggests that their perceptions are, on average, and that perhaps especially in times of crisis, when there is less time to think and to gather information, likely to be systematically biased in a particular direction. So to conclude, war is only a puzzle if we cling to the ideal of rational actors. Overconfidence is, historically speaking, a recurrent and powerful cause of war. The literature in cognitive psychology suggests we should expect overconfidence, unfortunately. And empirical studies suggest that we are especially overconfident about war. Overconfidence coexists with the negativity bias, which creates this especially toxic mix. And this has really poor prospects for the Russia-Ukraine war, all else equal. And beyond that, I think dangers in Europe and Asia, I'm not trying to be alarmist and suggest there's something around the corner, but I just think the dangers in Europe and Asia are likely to be greater than we realize, precisely because of our systematic misperceptions. If the ideal of rational actors is wrong, does that mean we lose the ability to predict behavior? Not at all. Biases can be more useful than the rational actor model, I would argue, because whatever the true status of a state's capabilities or threat, we at least know that people will tend to be biased in a specific direction. That means we can and should calibrate our planning to take account of these biases, which psychologists have mapped out in great detail and which recur in history time and time again. If we want to strategize effectively, deter, and prepare for or avoid war, we could do much more to take advantage of the science and history of perceptions and misperceptions. Otherwise, we can easily end up in wars that no one wanted. But to end, I hope the argument is compelling, but one other thing that Daniel Kahneman said is that I have yet to meet a successful scientist who lacks the ability to exaggerate the importance of what he or she is doing. But I hope you might have found the role of overconfidence in war illuminating. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Professor Johnson, for the very fascinating talk. You've given us a lot to think about. In trying to drill this down for those of our colleagues who, for example, are involved in, say, national security or international security decision-making fora groups, right? I guess one takeaway from your talk is that there are a number of factors that can combine within a decision-making forum to produce suboptimal outcomes such as overconfidence. You mentioned, for example, some psychological phenomena like anchoring, cognitive biases, groupthink, in-group, out-group bias, loss aversion, overconfidence, positive illusions. And one key thing you said, which I thought was very important for all of us to keep in mind, is how the interaction between the positive and negative biases can actually produce very disastrous outcomes. I think personally, I mean, I don't know about the colleagues here, but personally I find that argument very persuasive. One thing though, which I wanted to know what you think about is that there is also literature, and we were talking about this at lunch with our other colleagues, right? Literature which suggests that one of the problems, one of the factors that help to explain poor decision-making outcomes which lead to disasters on the ground is a very poor knowledge of history, right? So apart from the social psychological factors, lack of appropriate historical knowledge can also lead to disastrous outcomes. For example, there's some literature on analogies at war, right? Talking about the Vietnam War, when President Johnson was talking with his advisors about, whether or not to intervene and escalate the U.S. Participation in South Vietnam. Some of his advisors were saying, yes, we should. Why? Because of the Munich analogy, right? Because we failed to stand up to these dictators, right? We appeased them. We appeased the Nazis in Munich, and then we had World War II. We failed to stand up to the communists, and then we lost China. But there was only one or two guys in his group who were saying, you guys are talking about the wrong historical example. You should be thinking about Dien Bien Phu, right? If you do go down this route, you end up like the French, you get sucked in. So they just didn't understand the historical context of the region, the conflict zone they are talking about. And you mentioned that, looking at the Ukraine conflict, right? From the Russian perspective, they probably thought that, well, we succeeded in Crimea in 2014, we were pretty successful in Syria, why can't we succeed in Ukraine? So again, the historical knowledge is not there. Okay? So that's the first point I wanted to bring out just to supplement all you said about the social psychological factors. Then, of course, the second question is, so what are we going to do about it, right? So in any decision-making group, right, how do we moderate the interaction between the negativity and the positivity biases? Some literature I'm aware of, right, talks about why, in order to prevent groupthink and the rush towards bad decisions, you must always have somebody, one or two people in your group that come up with the opposite view. They may not believe in the opposite view, but their role is to just come up with the opposite view to challenge the prevailing consensus. Some scholars call this ritualized dissent, just to prevent, groupthink. So do you think this is something which is worth considering in order to prevent overconfidence and other suboptimal decision-making outcomes? Just two questions to start off.
Thank you, Kumar. Fantastic questions. Yeah, very briefly on the first one. Yeah, history is dangerous, right? Because two people can read the same history book and draw different lessons, especially political scientists who do a bit of a potted history and don't normally have time to go in the archives and write a whole book about a single case. Two things about history. I think one is that we have to be careful about which histories we select for exactly the reasons you suggest. You can draw the wrong analogies. In the negativity bias paper I mentioned with Dom Tierney, we look specifically at how nations tend to remember past wars. And our key point there is that the negativity bias seems to demonstrate in the literature, but also show in the historical record, that we are particularly likely to draw lessons from failure rather than from success. We went through Yuan Fukong's book to look at which were negative analogies and which were positive ones. Ernest May also had a book, Lessons of History, and he listed, I think, 100 examples at some point through the book. And I think 80-something of them were negative ones. So our point in that paper was the negativity bias seems to make us look at history in a little bit of a biased way, because we tend to focus on the negative, and we don't learn as much as we should from success. One example is between the world wars, Germany seemed to be a much better learner about the mistakes it made in the failure of World War I than the British and French, and that is partly what contributed to their early victories in the Second World War. But yeah, history is perhaps something we can talk more broadly about with the audience too. On the second question, what are we going to do about it? Yeah, there are two things which we sort of tend to write at the end of the papers. Okay, if biases are a problem, what do we do? Number one, devil's advocate in the room, the person you mentioned who challenges everything and tries to make sure we're not subject to groupthink and we're not lapsing into cognitive biases. One problem with that is this sort of happened in the Vietnam War with George Ball, who was called into the otherwise very small decision-making group with President Johnson and McNamara and others. And his role was always to challenge what they were doing. Why were they escalating? Why were they bombing that particular part of Vietnam? But apparently, the problem with this approach is that Johnson and McNamara felt good having listened to the other side. They'd heard George Ball out. They'd listened to him whining about what he thought was wrong with their policy. And having listened to that, they could then go ahead and do what they wanted. So there does seem to be a bit of a problem with the devil's advocate. But I do actually think it's better than nothing, and it should be done more, red teaming and devil's advocate. The second thing I tend to write at the end of papers is something about regime type. Because in theory, a democracy with an open decision-making process and strong political opposition should be relatively immune to these biases, right? If Boris Johnson has a crazy idea, it should be stamped out by everyone else. It doesn't always happen. But in theory, at least, democracy should be better at weeding out these biases and making sure the debate and the decisions are as rational as possible. And the opposite, of course, is authoritarian regimes, where in the extreme case, Julius Caesar can make any decision he likes. And if he's experiencing a cognitive bias which leads him in one particular direction, there may be no one to stop him. So I think democracy might be our one savior, but of course, looking back to the examples I gave at the beginning, it doesn't seem to be the solution either. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for questions from the floor. Yes, please. We'll get the mic, don't worry. Please briefly identify yourself for Professor Johnson's information.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Johnson. My name is Luke.
Yes.
My name is Lucas. I'm a recent RSIS graduate. I'm curious also, you've written about the fundamental attribution error and the way all...
I think the mic is, I don't think the mic is working. Is it on? Okay, it's on now. Thank
Sorry
you.
about that. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. My name is Lucas. I'm a recent RSIS graduate. I'm curious also about the fundamental attribution error, which you've written about, and as all evolutionary cognitive biases can be adaptive as well as maladaptive, do you see the fundamental attribution error, which overlaps with the negativity bias, attributing to any success or contributing to any of the relative successes by any parties in the Ukraine conflict?
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the question, Lucas. Yes, so the fundamental attribution error, horrible name, but really important bias. And the bias is that I tend to assume other people's behavior is driven by their disposition. If they do something, they do it because they intend to, they mean to do it. If I do the same thing, actually the reason I do it is because I'm constrained by the environment. So if I'm late for the lecture, it's because the traffic was bad, I had so much work to do before I got here. If Kumar's late for the lecture, it's because he's lazy or he doesn't keep time well. It's a very powerful bias. And you can imagine it plays havoc in international politics. And there's lots of other people who've studied the fundamental attribution error and what it does in international politics. So as an example of the things it can do which are bad, Deborah Larson has a wonderful book about the Cold War, arguing that both the Soviet Union and the US attributed every action on the other side as some nefarious intent to harm them. So it tended to increase hostility in the Cold War. But Lucas, you correctly identified that in my other book, which perhaps I can come back and talk about another time, Strategic Instincts, these cognitive biases can sometimes help us as well as hurt us in the right conditions. And the fundamental attribution error, I would argue, can be a good warning system, right? Maybe we should assume that other actors, especially other competitors in the international system, are nefarious or are doing things deliberately, perhaps to harm us. That might be the right bias to have. It can be costly because it can miss out on opportunities for cooperation. But in a dangerous world where no one is going to look after us, maybe that's the right bias to have. So in the book, I write about the fundamental attribution error in the Dominic crisis, and why Chamberlain did not seem to exhibit this expectation that Hitler was dispositionally disposed to aggression in Europe. Your question was, could it be useful somehow in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? I think it might have been if we had been a little bit more concerned about Russia before the invasion, but perhaps you had something more specific in mind.
I wondered if it, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I wondered if it contributed to preparation by Ukraine or the lack of it, the lack of preparation, or by Western allies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel the Western allies were totally unprepared. Ukraine was. I mean, they'd lost Crimea 6 years before, 8 years before. So it seems that they had been preparing for this possible eventuality for a long time, and maybe no one was listening to them. But were they biased to do so after Crimea? Maybe that was the rational thing to do, prepare for the unexpected. But it's a bit like in this book. I ask, where was the fundamental attribution error when we needed it in 1938? You could say the same thing here. Where was the fundamental attribution error when we needed it in 2022? That would be an interesting project for someone. Thank you for the question.
You have another question, please? Okay, we have. We'll take two. A gentleman there.
Thank you so much. My name is Asif Shuja. I'm from Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore. As Dr. Ramakrishna has alluded to the virtue of ritualized dissent. Let me experiment that. You have your fundamental theory is basically that people go to war because of overconfidence. I argue that one cannot win a war unless there is an overconfidence. So how do you explain it? Do you have any examples in the history where the warring people were underconfident, still they won a war, you know? That is point number one. Point number two, I fundamentally agree with your thesis, a really good one. So is there an application of your thesis in the stock market? If you could tell us something about that. Thank you so much.
Did you say the stock market?
Yeah, stock market, investment.
Just checking. All right, yes.
Thank you. My name is Hiro Mats, and I'm a Master in International Affairs student at the LKY Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I have a question about what you said about Putin's overconfidence during the invasion of Ukraine. You mentioned that even though Russia tried to invade the whole Ukraine, Russia didn't have enough troops to achieve that goal, and you portrayed that as a sign of Russia's overconfidence. But I was thinking that if Russia's goal was only to take over eastern Ukraine, then we might be able to say Putin deployed enough troops to achieve that limited goal. So Putin's war aim could change our assessment of his overconfidence. So I want to ask two questions. The first one is why do you think Putin was trying to take over the whole country? Whole Ukraine, and the second question is, if Putin's war aim was limited, then how could that change your assessment of Putin's overconfidence? Thank you.
Okay. Dominic, you can...
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. I think you were saying you need some level of confidence to win.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry to keep talking about a book I haven't talked about today, but in here I explore that argument. When is overconfidence advantageous? Do you need confidence to win? I think you need some level of confidence to win. The question is whether you need overconfidence. Do you need a confidence which is greater than warranted by the facts on the ground in order to aim for the stars and at least reach the moon? That's the idea, the self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it can be a crucial ingredient of standing up to fight in the first place, for persisting, for not giving up. You might argue that if Ukraine was a rational actor, it would have conceded, or Zelensky might have left the country. Something kept them going. As for an example of an underconfident state that fought, Winston Churchill comes to mind in 1940 when the rest of Europe had fallen, and he promised the British people blood, sweat, toil and tears. So maybe that's an interesting example to explore, except that of course they didn't go on to win without help from the Soviet Union and the United States. So it gets more complicated, but it would be interesting to go back and look at sides that were underconfident and whether they won. I don't have a better example right now. As for the stock market, a lot of this research actually, so social psychology, but Daniel Kahneman is a behavioral economist, and the economists have actually, they're the ones who are constantly advocating, historically, the rational actor model. But there's a whole subfield in economics now on behavioral economics precisely to work with the biases that have been identified and use that to improve their models, improve their predictions of human behavior, including particularly in the stock market. And it's one case where there seems to be a lot of very clear biases that are at play, like anchoring, like cognitive dissonance, people holding on to stocks, they're unwilling to sell them when they go down in price, but a rational actor should sell them just as they buy them when they're going up. So I think that you'd have a field day if you look into that literature. There's a lot on that. Not sure if that quite answers the question, but that's a start. Thank you. As for the question over here, didn't have enough troops to conquer the entire country. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what they expected. But the encircling of Kyiv and the clear plan to take Kyiv, I think, betrays overconfidence. They didn't achieve it. Might they have done? If we could rerun the tape of history, who knows? but clearly they overstepped their capability. Might he actually have only wanted eastern Ukraine? It is interesting to consider that one strategy for getting Donbass into Russian territory would be to start off with a massive grasp for much more of Ukraine. And then by scaling back, at least other Western allies think, okay, well, at least the rest of the Ukraine is safe. Maybe we can give them Donbass. And who knows what will happen in the future with the negotiations. But one wonders if a strategy might have been to reach far into Ukraine precisely to make it more palatable to then withdraw just to the Donbass. I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking. But it seems to me that in the narrative that Ukraine is part of Russia, there is underneath all of this an implicit expectation that the whole of Ukraine would come into the Russian sphere. But we could perhaps argue about that more. But even if that is the case, it strikes me that overconfidence was clearly there in the huge effort to try and get to Kyiv.
Thank you very much. Any final question? Yes. Hang on. Junyan first. Okay, we'll take two final questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Johnson. Jun from Rajaram School. Which one is more important, right? Negativity or overconfidence? And if you could eliminate one, right, put it back into Pandora's box, if you would, or at the very least reduce or mitigate it, which is better to reduce the possibility of war? Thank you.
And final question from...
Hi, Professor Johnson. I'm Artemis from Military Studies program at RSIS. I have a question about your other book, and it concerns the strategic advantages of overconfidence. So a lot of things have obviously changed since you wrote that book, and I've actually studied that particular theory. I want to know what the Ukraine war, what implications the Ukraine war has on your theory, specifically regarding deterrence and attracting allies, because we haven't really seen that happen. Perhaps we can make an argument that Russia did attract some allies through overconfidence through public opinion in China, but that is the only example I can think of. But in other places, of course, there has been no sign of support for Russia.
Yeah,
that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Great questions again. Thank you. Jin, which is more important? Right. Daniel Kahneman has already waved his magic wand to get rid of overconfidence, so I'll wave mine to get rid of the negativity bias. I think I would, because the negativity bias in our Bad World paper seems to affect pre-war planning, loss aversion during war, and then what we call failure salience, the dominance of negative memories after war. So it seems to occupy these many time periods and have these bad effects, whereas overconfidence seems to be particularly a problem on the eve of war. So it might be that it's sort of as bad, but over more time. The other reason is overconfidence is in this book as a candidate for sometimes being useful. Negativity bias is not. I think it does have its advantages. I mentioned with the fundamental attribution error that it's like a fire alarm, a smoke alarm that warns us of bad things that might happen and makes us err on the side of caution. But it is striking in the historical record how often we exaggerate threats and spend billions or trillions trying to deal with them and missing opportunities along the way. So off the cuff, I'll go with negativity bias to be banned by the magic wand. Thanks. Nice question. Artemis, thank you for your question. Strategic advantage of overconfidence. Yeah. So I actually had a couple of slides in case we had time, but I'd talked way too long and I wanted to discuss with you. But the slide was entitled, "What about Ukraine?" I barely mentioned Ukraine. And interestingly, the optimism of the Ukrainian people, and Zelensky in particular, is striking. They decided to stay and fight and continue fighting before they knew that anyone was really going to come and help them. And they've achieved amazing results from steadfastly, doggedly carrying the fight, not giving up when I think arguably a rational actor might have done. So I think you're right that we don't see some of these sometimes beneficial advantages of overconfidence as acting as a deterrent. If anything, it drove NATO together. People were wondering, what's NATO for, in Europe, until quite recently. Now we know. He's shot himself in the foot there. NATO has expanded. Attracting allies, there's very few people to attract, it seems. He's got Belarus. China seems pretty hesitant to, lean into this in any strong way. So it doesn't seem to have helped Putin. But it clearly, I would argue, has helped Ukraine. In whatever level of optimism we might grant that they have shown, I think that has encouraged allies to join in the fight. We are joining in because we have faith that the Ukrainians are going to keep fighting. If we didn't, I think we would be much more cautious about the amount of involvement that we would have. So I think to the extent that the Ukraine is overconfident, or let me rephrase that, to the extent that the Ukraine is confident and determined, that has successfully helped attract allies. Does that answer the question?
Well, we've come to the end of a very rich and very personally, I found a very stimulating session, presentation and discussion with Professor Johnson. So please, can I invite you to join me in thanking Professor Johnson for his remarks.